You know, back in the days before digital photography, you could say that things were much simpler. When you bought a new camera, the hardest thing you had to learn was how to access everything in the dark. There were no menus, no auto exposure, no autofocus, just the camera and you thinking like a photographer. You'd pop your film in, set the ISO, take a reading, and then change two dials, shutter speed and aperture. It really was that simple. Let's see if we can make manual exposure that simple for you today. Hi, I'm Tony Bramley. I've been a professional photographer for over 25 years. I help people just like you with my one-to-one training and group workshops. I provide judging for camera clubs and also, like you, shoot just for fun. Join me as I pass on a few wise words and probably some stupid ones too in a creative world called photography. Believe me, this is not one take. That was very true, and the hardest intro I've had to do to date. Assembling the blad was quite easy, but getting all those words together with it, yeah, that's another story. In fact, probably another 20 stories if I remember correctly. Anyway, back in the days before digital photography and having the options for auto exposure and autofocus, as a keen photographer, the first thing you just learned and understood was manual exposure. You had to. And it was then that you got on with the harder part of photography, making pictures. You won't see many booklets like these anymore, but back in those days when you bought a camera, after learning how to load the film, the first thing you really needed to do was to master manual exposure. If you shy away from manual exposure, and I'm not talking about just occasionally because maybe it's a quicker option or you might lose the action when something happens quickly on the street, you might have to ask yourself, are you getting the best from your image? Do you even know where you want the exposure to be? And what is the correct exposure? Not in your camera's eyes, but your own. This is what this brief series of 3 videos is all about. Some simple tips to help you understand that most of the time shooting on manual exposure will allow you to choose how successfully your images will be. I have seen too many soft images by students caused by slow shutter speeds on aperture priority, too many with the incorrect depth of field on shutter priority, and too many of both on any other combination of auto. As well as I've got to say on manual as well, so let's be fair. Is there not a greater sense of accomplishment when taking pictures when you look at the scene in front of you and you get in the camera to record what you see and at the highest quality available in the current conditions? So enough waffle, let's get on and pretend to load some 160 ISO film into the back of the camera. And as I mentioned in the opening, we only have to assess 2 dials for taking manual exposure readings from here. Look out for part 2 where I'll show you if you're using auto, aperture or shutter priority, and if you're using it correctly you shouldn't need it at all, at least for not 95% of the time. And finally, in the last part, if you do get confused with the numbers, I'll give you 2 or 3 tips to help you through. Now I am going to be shooting on my Fuji X-T3 for this video, but I thought I'd relate back to the Hasselblad at the beginning here. Unusually the lenses have an EV scale underneath so that you can take an EV reading. That stands for exposure value, so you can just use one number with Hasselblad lenses. Some handheld exposure meters still offer this today, like this one from Sekonic, which is still available, and you still get EV settings on digital meters as well. Turning the camera the correct way up, we can see the 2 dials, shutter speed and the aperture number. And these are what we're going to deal with for this video. At the end of this video I have included 2 or 3 screenshots from my companion guide on manual exposure, so take a look at those and you're welcome to take a screen grab from them. There is also a link below for this guide on Amazon if you want to take a look at that for Kindle or in paperback. However, at the end of the 3rd video I will offer 10 Kindle versions of these as a giveaway, so do watch out for that. So here we are outside with a high key subject on a medium to low key background. Just a quick point of interest, but the Fujis do have a screw thread on the shutter release, which means you can use these shutter release cables, which you can pick up for about £1 these days second hand. I'm not sure what the electronic ones cost, but I'm sure it's a lot more than £1. Now here's a typical camera exposure meter, and I just want to point out the middle one here, and that is 0. Remember, this is not the actual exposure, but it's the starting point. This is always what auto will choose unless you use exposure compensation, but more about that in the second video. Many people don't reference this when shooting auto, and it's worth referencing this just to get an idea on the dynamic range of the lighting, as well as just checking on what that shutter speed is doing if you're shooting on aperture priority. You can see I've got here 160 ISO set, and I'm just changing the aperture to get to f10 for a bit more depth of field. The camera is set to aperture priority, and this helps for a good starting point if you're confused with numbers, so straight away you can see a shutter speed of 15th of a second. ISO is at 160 because that's the best quality on this camera, and I want good quality from this picture. Like I said, aperture I need to have a bit more depth of field, so f10. And as I'm shooting in low light, we're down to low levels of shutter speed, so a 15th of a second or thereabouts means I'm going to be working on a tripod. Just make sure I don't get any camera shake. And by the way, I can get camera shake on a 50mm equivalent lens if I'm a little bit sloppy with a shutter button, down at 1/250th of a second, so don't try and chance it if the picture's important to you. Now I use spot metering, and let's see what happens on auto when you start moving that focus point around, and see how the exposure changes. The camera's making the decisions and not you. You'll also see the histogram as well jumping all over the place. And this can happen with other metering patterns as well, but not as extreme, but be aware of this. You've only got to move a little bit between seeing the picture and taking a shot, and on auto, suddenly it all changes. Now I've moved over to manual here, and I've dialed in 15 as a starting point. And the picture does look too dark, and I've not got any highlight warnings showing, and that histogram is well over to the left. So let's open up the shadows. And I've just pushed it too far, and that highlight warning is coming into place. But dialing back, look what the correct exposure is showing now, 1/4 of a second. That's 2 stops difference in exposure, and it's still protecting those highlights, and it's not crushing the shadows and blacks. Now if I'm going to advise you to expose the histogram to the right, I want to prove something to you. Because on the internet and in some magazines you'll hear people saying that noise is just coming from the sensor and you can underexpose and pull it back in post-production. And that is really not the case, and here's the proof. The image on the left was underexposed by 5 stops, and the one on the right was actually exposed for the correct exposure. And pulling that back, you can see the amount of increased noise that's come through. That's actual proof. They don't always show you this when you see it online. You will get away with this with a PDI, but if you want a large print, you will start to see this noise coming through. And it may well be that you want the blacks crushed. There's no correct exposure, it's where you want it, but make sure you get the exposure bringing in the maximum quality. So let's take the picture and just check the histogram at the end. And we can see the right hand side of the histogram has not been clipped, and there's more volume in the information for the shadows and blacks on the left hand side. Here's the image in Adobe Camera Raw. I've got the highlight warning checked in the top right hand side, so there's no highlights blown through on this. And this is the final image with a little bit of burning in, and remember, dodging and burning is still important in our post-production, more so than anything else. More importantly, with this image I do have more detail and less noise in the shadows and blacks. If you've not seen my video on dodging and burning, then I'll leave a link in the end screen for you so you can take a look at that. As promised, here are some screenshots from my exposure companion guide. This one is an example of thought process for exposure. This one is a very simple grid showing the exposure triangle and what each one does. Now this one is the Sunny 16 rule, so if you've never used this, it's good fun to just use now and again and try guessing your exposures, and that will help you with like starting points, particularly on brighter days. This is my manual exposure guide on Amazon, but do remember on the third video I make I will offer 10 of these up as a giveaway.